Ladies and gentlemen, we have live CF Jangara here from in Oz, Australia, live from the bushfires for an update. We have several topics we're going to talk about, including livestock losses, bees being lost, and milk shortages, and maybe some problems with the management of water in the region, which could be leading to these devastating losses. It's a pleasure to have you on, CF. How are you? You're at work, and what's happening with the fires?
Yeah, so the fires are actually starting to they're continuing, regardless of this cool and damp weather that we're having. The fires are continuing to burn on, and many of the rural locations and national parks and state parks are still burning. So, unfortunately, because of that, it means that I don't see an end to these fires for a number of weeks yet. These fires in the national parks, particularly in the alpine region, are burning so hot that they are literally pulling themselves together. Where the two big fires are, I think they're only about a kilometre apart now, and when they join together, they will make a fire that is 500,000 hectares in size, and that will be one of the largest fires ever recorded. Now, unfortunately, all those national parks and state parks are surrounded by farmland where people have tremendous amounts of livestock, and the losses are just ticking up and up and up and up and up. All the reports that are coming out at the moment are catastrophic. When we're looking at Victoria alone, Victoria have just put out estimates that 13,000 head of beef and dairy cattle and sheep have been killed in the last week alone. Now, that's just Victoria. When we look at potentially New South Wales, you can nearly double that again. And then there's a series of piggeries, there's a series of chicken farms, all sorts of different farming produce, vegetable farmers. There's going to be a huge loss in Australia's food in its ability to deliver. So that's really starting to get onto the mainstream news now, and the government's actually starting to get quite paranoid about it. And from what I've been hearing, there's even talk within certain departments around new strategies having to be brought into play.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a very bad situation currently. What do you know about the bee losses up at the apiaries?
So, unfortunately, it's really disturbing because Australia's got some of the strongest bee colonies around. We've had very little of the varroa mite here in Australia, and particularly on Kangaroo Island, where over 2/3 of all the apiaries are now destroyed from fire. There are also, I think there's about 5,000 hives that are actually residing within the state and national parks, and I think from the figures that I've been trying to track down, over half of them have been destroyed as well. So there are a lot of bees coming out of nests that are now looking for natural places around my farm in particular where it hasn't burned yet. And so I'm getting a lot of bees arriving at my property because my property is one of the large national parks residing next to it, which haven't been burnt yet. And so there are bees appearing from everywhere, and they must be coming from some of those hives that have been burnt out. But as you know full well, in most cases when there's a large amount of smoke, the bees will either pack up and all go, or they'll all die together. So it's going to really be a massive loss to the apiary industry here in Australia over the next year or two. It's going to take a long time to recover.
Now let's talk about the ADF and the 7-day race to help bury hundreds of thousands of farm animals that are killed. I mean, and this is amidst all the smoke. How are they doing that? And biosecurity fears.
Yeah, they've had to bring in the Army engineer, and the Army engineering group basically are digging huge trenches with heavy Army digging machinery, and they're having to collect all the dead animals from the paddocks and into on the sides of the road and put them into these big trenches, lace them with huge amounts of lime, and then bury them again. If they are allowed to rot in the open, the chances of disease spreading is enormous, and the smell will be horrific. It has to be done so quickly, and you really wouldn't want to be the person doing the job. On top of that, they've also got a large number of vets who have been requested to go to those areas to euthanize some of the burnt animals as well. So it's quite tragic. Seeing all of the articles online and all the pictures of all the dead animals lying in the paddocks where they couldn't get out because the gates were locked, and then seeing 100 animals sitting on the side of the road, especially that picture at Batlow, is it's quite heartbreaking.
In the face of all this, the major cities, they're all safe currently. It's just the infrastructure that's being destroyed. The farming, the bees, the milk. Is there any threat to any of the major cities currently?
There are fires that are being lit around the outskirts of Sydney. Now, 6 fires were lit around the outskirts of Sydney in the last weekend's high fire risk weekend. And those fires have been skirting around outer suburbs. Luckily, they haven't been too big and they've put them out. This coming weekend will be a very close call for Canberra. I'm still waiting for the models to update again, and I'll probably try and do a weather report for that this evening, because looks like an opportunity for the large alpine fire to come into the back of Canberra, which is a similar pattern to what it did in 2003. And I've been highly concerned about the directions that these fires are going towards the back of the Brindabella Mountains and into Canberra. As for the dairy situation, the dairy industry in New South Wales in particular supplies half of the country's milk, with 2/3 of all of the dairies now offline that are located in the southeast and in the Murray River region around Tumbarumba and Batlow. Now, not all the animals are dead, but they can't be milked because the power's out. And so cattle, when they're not milked, their system shuts down. They stop producing milk, and so it's going to take a long time for those systems and those cattle to come back online. There's already food and produce and milk and even meat now becoming scarcer on the shelves, whilst produce is coming from other parts of the country which wouldn't normally be the case. So there's a big shift going on. We've got the Navy sitting offshore at the moment, and they're moving large amounts of food from Sydney down to those coastal towns and delivering as many goods and bits and pieces to those local communities as possible, because the roads are still closed due to the fact that there's so many trees falling over the roads. So it's I don't ever remember seeing anything of this scale in my 45 years ever.
So it's imperative that people listening that are out there in these regions to go out right now and stock up on all the supplies they can for their own benefit.
Yeah. But the problem is that people are stocking up on things that are perishable, and the power is fluctuating, and so they're buying huge amounts of perishable goods, and then they're going to have those perishable goods perish because they're not going to have the power consistently to keep them cool. And so people are panicking and they're doing silly things rather than looking at long-term food reserves where you can rehydrate it, or you've got canned goods or things like that, which is the common sense approach for someone who's got preparation skills. People are going, I'm going to go out and buy 20 kilos of milk. I'm going to buy 10 litres of milk. And they're rushing out and they're buying it, and all that food could perish if the power goes out. And the power is going out in many of these areas like a yo-yo as they replace all these burnt power poles. So unfortunately, there's a lot of people who aren't quite thinking straight, and they're going to exacerbate some of the problems for themselves.
So, how are you holding up emotionally and physically? I mean, clearly you're at work. Is your property still
Yeah, look,
under threat? How are you doing?
I'm okay. The reality is the smoke's been the biggest thing for me. I'm an asthmatic. I've had to deal with smoke over much of my firefighting career as well, and I've got a fairly strong set of lungs in that respect. But when you put a bit of mental stress onto yourself on top of that smoke, you do get a bit of a weak system. I haven't slept well. Last night, luckily, we had a little bit of rain, and it was a cool, foggy, damp night, and there was no smoke around, and so I'm feeling fantastic today because I actually slept properly finally. Um, I am, however, completely and utterly aware that all these fires are slowly encroaching into my area. And by all of the fire maps and all of the directions of the wind and the weather that is coming, I know the fire is going to get to me eventually. It's a terrible thing to actually have to process through your brain that you know you're going to get burnt out. Now, I've prepared a hell of a lot. I've put in huge amounts of mineral earth lines around the house, and so there's no fuel on the ground. Embers are the only real danger for me, and a crown fire is the only real danger for me. So if the fire's coming through the top of the trees and with big winds, I'm out of there. I'll let the place burn. If it's crawling through the forest on the floor, I can attack it. I've got my fire pumps. I've got plenty of water to be able to attack that. And I'm very experienced in attacking that type of fire. So I'm very confident that if the fire comes on the ground at a reasonable pace, I can deal with it quite comfortably.
So, what's the news out of Australia? How many? A lot of these fires are being set. There was some news out several years ago about bushfires being set by people, but many of these
Yeah.
fires are arson. You just talked about a bunch of fires being set around Sydney, and what can you tell us about
Yeah.
that?
So there's an estimation now that between 180 and 230 arrests have been made in the last 12 months around arson and bushfires. Now, there's been also lots of reports of international visitors to the country who aren't aware of the total fire ban situation, and they're going to campgrounds and they're lighting small campfires. And I know of at least 6 of those little small campfires that have got out of control, and they've been as a result of these little campfires not being put out properly and high winds coming through and igniting. I believe there was one recently that started in that exact way. There's a lot of information getting around on social media and in parts of the media. The media's being very quiet about it, but around social media there are a lot of reports of Australians confronting some of these international visitors and trying to tell them to put the fire out. It's a total fire ban. You're not allowed to have the fire. And a lot of those people are actually getting upset and trying to fight over it to tell them to go away. And yeah, it's just unfortunate because one small flame, it's all you need, one small ember coming off that with a little gust of wind and it's off in the bush. And most of these people don't have enough water to, even put the campfire out.
Well,
So
let's talk about the article you sent me about landscape rehydration, better than dams. Talk
yeah,
about it.
that's a cool one. So on a farm nearby my property, it's about 30 kilometres over the mountain range. There's a group of people who set up a very industrial type permaculture. Now, what they've done is they've restored a drought ravaged property to a level whereby the creek that ran into it eroded the landscape so heavily because of the lack of appropriate management. Cattle had broken down the banks of the creeks, and there was no water being stored on the property at all. and I can't remember his name, but his name is Peter. Surname I can't remember. But he decided to start implementing small weirs down his creek and small swales and small keyline swales to channel and direct and hold the water in the landscape by slowing it down. As you know with permaculture, it is the ultimate way to hold water in the landscape because you're slowing it down. You're allowing it to absorb into the landscape, and if you do that over a successive period of time, your creeks continue to run during a drought. Now, Maloon Creek at the moment has water running out of that farm. It's probably the only creek in a 200-kilometre area that is still running. And every other creek in the area is bone dry. You can lift the rocks up in those creeks and they're bone dry under the rocks and everything. So
permaculture is the solution.
Absolutely.
One of my first videos was swale success in the high desert. And you can build soil, and you can rehydrate the land.
And I remember that video. That was one of the very first videos I watched of yours, and that's part of the path that I started to take with my property. As you've seen, I've started to implement swales and key lines and little bits and pieces to build a permaculture garden. And it is the most amazing thing to see the response in the land when you do this. Now, this Maloon Institute has now got the eye of the state and federal governments, and they are looking to implement this as a nationwide option. It does change and break many of the existing water rules where you're not allowed to store or inhibit the flow of the creeks. But in nature, I can show you in my own creek when trees fall across the creek, they eventually create a small cofferdam. And then below that dam, in the next pool below, it's always running through there and there's water crest in the creek. And I've still got pools in my creek when those little cofferdams are there. They've all been washed away by a big flood last year. So, but when you build these rock wall weirs and you put in the right types of grasses, it doesn't matter what flood comes through; they stay there. It's a fantastic thing, and I'd suggest that anyone who's got an opportunity go to the MaloonInstitute.org. It's a great, it's an eye opener. There's a couple of videos I think on my YouTube channel in one of my drought libraries as well that has an extensive 36-minute video that was done on that entire solution because it's been enormously controversial here. And a lot of the governments and many of the Green parties and everyone like that, they don't understand the simple science behind it. And so they think that you're holding the water back and you're preventing it from running down the rivers. And so they've rejected it. But it looks like it's finally got a lot of weight behind it now. And the government will have no choice soon. They will have to implement something that holds the water in the landscape. And I can't wait to see permaculture being implemented at a scale.
Well, we can hope for that in the future. It's always a pleasure, Giles. Check out Giles over at CF Jangara on his YouTube channel. Thank you for taking time out of your professional life to update us on the fires in Australia. And we love you, man. Keep up the good work.
Not a problem, Dom. Love you too, mate. Cheers.